Most people think about war as being fought between countries. You know, like if France goes to war, who are they fighting? Germany or something. But actually, most of the bloodiest wars ever fought aren't between countries at all. They're civil wars. They're fought within countries against other people from within the same country. And because they're so brutal and they're so bloody, they can change the entire world. Hi, everyone. This is Crash Course World History. Today, we are going to talk about how civil wars can change the world. So let's do it. By the end of this episode, you will be able to explain how civil wars both reflect and transform political conflicts within states. So you should probably know what a civil war is. That's when two or more groups from the same state, usually with opposing political goals, take up arms against one another. And while there have been many civil wars throughout history, for the sake of our discussion today, we'll focus on three. Julius Caesar's Civil War in 50 BC, the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865, and the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939. The first civil war that we're going to look at is Julius Caesar's Civil War in 50 BC. Now, before we get into the specifics of the Civil War, we need to back up a minute here. Rome had, by this point, been a republic for centuries. That meant that theoretically, no one person held all the power. Instead, the government was run by elected officials and assemblies representing various classes of Roman citizens. However, really, since the 1st century BCE, a small group of very powerful men known as the optimates and populares had come to dominate politics, kind of like a shadow government. And this group kept getting smaller and smaller as these two factions feuded and fought each other, making it easier and easier for someone to come along and seize all the power for themselves. Enter Julius Caesar. He was a member of the populares faction, and he rose through the ranks of Roman politics to become dictator, even though he didn't hold the title. For our purposes here, he was basically the most powerful guy in Rome. So naturally, the Senate, dominated by the Optimates faction, declared him a public enemy and took up arms against him. Now, this war wasn't so much a war as it was Caesar basically marching his army across Italy while the Senate ran away from him. And that's because Caesar had built up a huge base of support among the common folk. Part of that was due to his land reform program, which redistributed land owned by the Roman nobility to poor farmers. He also enacted other policies popular with the masses, such as devaluing currency to make it easier for folks to pay their debts and lowering taxes on the poor. However, those policies were deeply unpopular with the Senate, especially since Caesar seemed to be taking more and more power for himself. And so the war continued until Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, though after he was killed, his adopted son Octavian emerged victorious over his assassins and the Senate to take control of the Roman world. We'll talk about him in a later episode. But for now, we've established that civil wars can result in the collapse of existing governments and the rise of new ones. Let's move on. Let us go to the other side of the globe now to see another civil war that changed the world. The American Civil War. When the United States was founded, slavery was still legal in most of the country. But over time, as more and more Northerners became industrialized and urbanized, they began to see slavery as an institution that was increasingly out of step with the modern world. Meanwhile, Southerners grew to depend on enslaved labor to work their plantations and process crops like cotton, which were essential to the Southern economy. And so as the two sides grew further and further apart politically, the possibility of dissolving the Union became a real concern. So much so that in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected on an anti-slavery platform, which led 11 Southern states to secede from the Union and form the Confederate States of America. And then they attacked a federal fort in South Carolina, kicking off the Civil War. Now this war was pretty different from Caesar's Civil War. For one thing, it was fought during the Industrial Age, so new technologies like railroads, steamships, telegraph communication, and the machine gun made it much deadlier. Also, the US wasn't being ruled by a dictator. Secession was based on the idea that states had the right to leave the Union, so the North fought to preserve the Union, while the South fought to establish their independence. In fact, it was the bloodiest war in US history, with an estimated 620,000 soldiers killed, nearly 11% of the total population of the time. And when the South was defeated in 1865, the institution of slavery in the US finally ended, and although the war didn't go very well for Native Americans, several tribes took advantage of the chaos to briefly establish independent governments in Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas. But even though they failed to maintain their independence, the legacy of the Civil War continues to influence American politics to this day. So far, we've seen how civil wars can lead to new governments and challenge existing ones, but they can also be used by groups seeking to overthrow oppressive governments. The Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939 saw a variety of factions fight to overturn the government of Spain. Like many civil wars, this one had been brewing for a while. In the early 20th century, Spain was under the control of a right-wing dictatorship. As a result, democratic socialists and communists called for a revolution to overthrow the government and establish a new one based on principles of democracy and equality. However, the military and conservative elements of society opposed them, and soon a full-blown civil war erupted. This was another war shaped by the industrial age. Both sides used tanks, air power, and sophisticated weapons. But perhaps more importantly, this war is considered a precursor to World War II. Both the Republicans and the Fascists were eager to use the conflict as a testing ground for new weapons and military tactics. In fact, the war was effectively a battle between fascism and communism, which at the time were two of the most powerful political ideologies in the world. And when the Republicans won in 1939, it appeared that fascism would prevail. But this war isn't over yet. We're going to pick it back up in the next episode. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. And speaking of subscribing, I should probably do that too. Okay, so let's review everything we've learned. Civil wars happen within a country when two or more groups with opposing political goals take up arms against each other. The first civil war we examined, Julius Caesar's Civil War in 50 BC, showed us how civil wars can result in the collapse of existing governments and the rise of new ones. Next, the American Civil War demonstrated how civil wars can be shaped by the new technologies of the industrial age, and it showed us how civil wars can preserve or change existing governments. Finally, the Spanish Civil War illustrated how civil wars can be used by groups seeking to overthrow oppressive governments, and that they can also serve as a testing ground for new military tactics and technologies. But why are civil wars so important? Well, for one thing, civil wars show us patterns of behavior in large groups of people. When you understand those patterns, you can start to predict how they might react in the future. But even more importantly, by recognizing those patterns in the past, we can work to prevent them from happening again in the future. Take the Spanish Civil War, for example. Although the Republicans lost in the end, the international response to the war led to important changes in policy. As the Soviet Union began supplying the Republicans with weapons and the League of Nations failed to stop the Republicans from bombing Guernica, the international community began to realize that fascism could only be stopped with military force. This realization led to the formation of the Anti-Comintern Pact between Britain and Soviet Russia, which ultimately laid the foundation for the Grand Alliance that would defeat fascism in World War II. But civil wars can also remind us of what happens when an extremist group takes control. If the Republicans had won the Spanish Civil War, Europe might have looked very different heading into World War II. Or if the Confederacy had won the American Civil War, the United States might never have become a fully realized democracy. Understanding the causes and effects of civil wars helps us understand what not to do. And that's where you come in. What are your thoughts on the role of civil wars in shaping our world? You can share your thoughts below. And if you want to help keep this content free for everyone forever, you can join our community on a crowdfunding platform. Our patrons also get access to a monthly podcast, blooper reels, and more. So if you're interested, check it out. Thanks for hanging out with us here. I'll see you next time. Bye.